The first thing that unsettled Matthew wasn't the woman walking toward his table, but the small hand clutching her dress, the tiny sneakers hesitating on the polished cafe floor as if the world had suddenly grown too loud. His coffee had barely cooled, his phone still open to a half-written text about escape plans, and in that instant, his expectations shattered into something heavier, something that pressed against his chest without warning. He had come thinking this would be simple, disposable, another evening to survive and forget. Instead, his breath caught, and he wondered, without meaning to, what he would do if his life surprised him like this, if responsibility arrived uninvited and asked to be seen. What if this happened to you, right when you thought you had nothing left to give? Matthew had agreed to the blind date out of exhaustion rather than hope. At 36, living in Columbus, Ohio, his life had become a series of long workdays, quiet nights, and carefully avoided memories. 2 years earlier, grief had hollowed him out after a drunk driver took his younger brother, leaving Matthew with guilt he never learned to set down. He had stopped imagining a future that included anyone else, because caring felt dangerous, like tempting fate. Friends insisted he needed to try again, to sit across from someone new, to remember that life could still offer warmth. He told himself it was just coffee, just an hour of polite smiles, nothing more. Rachel arrived with tired grace, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested mornings rushed and nights too short. She looked apologetic without saying a word, her eyes flicking to Matthew as if bracing for disappointment. The little girl beside her studied the room with solemn curiosity, then pointed toward Matthew's table with a seriousness that made his throat tighten. Matthew stood automatically, his practiced indifference slipping as he registered how young the child was, maybe 2 or 3, her presence both innocent and seismic. He felt foolish for not asking more questions beforehand, for assuming the world would stay neatly uncomplicated. They sat, and the cafe noise seemed to blur into the background. Matthew noticed how Rachel kept one arm protectively close, how her shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with the child's size. He learned, not through dialogue but through observation and the way her eyes softened, that this little girl was named Hannah, and that she was the center of Rachel's universe. Matthew had never considered himself good with children. He had avoided them since his brother's death, afraid of loving something fragile. Yet when Hannah reached for a sugar packet and laughed at the crinkle, something unexpected loosened inside him. As the minutes passed, Matthew felt his carefully maintained walls begin to tremble. Rachel's life had clearly not followed the path she once imagined. There was struggle etched into the lines of her hands, hardship in the way she watched the door as if expecting trouble to walk back in. Matthew sensed that she carried her own history of disappointment, of promises broken and nights spent wondering how to keep going. He found himself thinking about choice, about how quickly circumstances could redefine a person. If you were in this situation, would you stand up and leave, protecting your comfort? Or would you stay and risk being changed? Matthew stayed. He listened, not to words but to silences, to the pauses where pain lived. He thought of his brother, of how life had demanded strength without asking permission. He wondered if love was less about finding someone unbroken and more about recognizing brokenness without turning away. When Hannah tugged at his sleeve and offered him a crumbly cookie piece with unquestioning trust, he felt a sting behind his eyes that surprised him. It had been a long time since anyone had offered him anything without fear. After the cafe, they walked together along the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows that felt symbolic in ways Matthew didn't fully understand. He learned that Rachel worked 2 jobs, that Hannah's father had vanished before she was born, that resilience had become a daily discipline rather than a virtue. Matthew felt the pull of old instincts telling him this was too much, too complicated, that he was not built for this kind of life. Yet another voice, quieter but persistent, asked him why he believed he deserved simplicity after surviving loss. Why did he think love should be easy? The days that followed surprised him even more. He expected the connection to fade, for reality to reassert itself and restore his emotional distance. Instead, he found himself thinking about Hannah's laugh during meetings, about Rachel's tired smile when she texted him updates from her break. He noticed how his apartment felt less empty when he imagined a small pair of shoes by the door, how his grief softened when shared space entered his thoughts. Change did not arrive dramatically. It crept in, subtle and undeniable. Matthew struggled with fear as much as hope. He worried about failing them, about reopening wounds he had sealed shut for survival. There were nights he lay awake, confronting the possibility that love could be taken again, that loss was the price of attachment. But there were also moments of quiet joy, of watching Hannah fall asleep on his shoulder during a movie, of seeing Rachel exhale for the first time in years when she realized she was not alone anymore. Hardship had not vanished. Bills still piled up, exhaustion lingered, and memories still hurt. Yet something new had taken root alongside the pain. Months passed, and Matthew understood that the blind date had never been blind at all. It had forced him to see beyond his own scars, to recognize that healing often comes disguised as responsibility. He realized that Hannah had changed him not by demanding anything, but by existing fully, by trusting without reservation. Rachel's strength humbled him. Her vulnerability taught him courage. In choosing to stay, Matthew discovered that second chances rarely look like fresh starts. They look like messy, imperfect continuations that ask more from us than we planned to give. On a quiet evening, as Matthew watched Hannah chase fireflies in a small Ohio backyard, while Rachel leaned against him, weary but smiling, he felt the weight of his brother's absence settle into something gentler. Grief had not disappeared, but it had transformed, woven into a life that now included laughter and purpose. He thought about the man he had been walking into that cafe, convinced he had nothing left to offer. He almost didn't recognize him. Before this story ends, take a moment and tell us in the comments what choice you think you would have made if you were Matthew, standing at that table with your expectations shattered. Life doesn't always ask politely before it changes us, and love rarely arrives in the form we imagine. But sometimes the smallest hand reaching out can lead us back to ourselves. If this story truly touched your heart, gently reminding you of kindness, regret, hope, or the power of second chances, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing so more stories like this can find their way to those who need them.